And that brings me neatly on to the nettle dress, which I realize we haven't really talked about properly yet. So because you're going to be all modest about it, I'm sure. But the I had been to many events with you over the last few years. The nettle dress has been showing there, and I've never managed to see it all the way through, just because I've been dashing about or been in organisation mode. So I organised the showing now that you can actually watch it in your own home and download it. It's from Curzon, isn't it? You can
That's
download.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, we downloaded it, a group of friends and I, in the living room, and we watched it, and it was absolutely lovely. But I think for people who don't know, Alan and his colleague Dylan, isn't it?
That's
Dylan?
right. Yeah.
Yeah, they documented the whole process of creating a dress from nettle fibres growing locally to Alan's home. But I'll let Alan tell you about it because he can tell you more better than me.
Yeah.
Tell
I
us
mean,
about
so the origins of the whole thing was Dylan coming around one day to film me on my spinning wheel, and I said, look, Dill, while you're here, do you mind if I can just get you to just film me demonstrating the various steps that I've honed down of how I take a raw nettle into getting the fiber out, because there were like a handful of people online I was in discussion with, and I thought, oh man, if I can just show them, it would just save so much time rather than typing out verbally. So we did that. He did that. He created this short film, which is called Nettle for Textiles. And that was just a really simple how-to thing, which we put up for free on YouTube. And yeah, much to our complete surprise, it just got shared all around the world, had millions of views. And we were just like, wow, who would have thought that there was interest in such a nuanced thing? Um, and off the back of that, Gillian, whose book I just showed, and my friend Bridget and friend Judy in Canada, we set up a Facebook group and a website of the same name, just to really capture that interest. And the idea being that kind of like a community science program, citizen science program, the more people we had uh, sharing their insights about how they process nettle, what nettles they use, the more we would learn collectively. So that was the sort of yeah, and that that group's now 30,000 strong and growing on Facebook. And so much really interesting stuff has come up. People have scoured newspapers, anecdotally remembered grandparents using nettles, and it's connected us up with the Nepalese nettle growers and Kenyan nettle growers, and yeah, this incredible resource. So anyway, um, you know, the idea started to form in my head that rather than just those little scraps of samples that I showed you at various things of events we were at, I just thought, man, it'd be really nice to round this project off with actually going the whole way and making a garment. So Dylan just sort of continued shooting, and every time, most of the time was spent spinning. That's the bottleneck of textile production, is spinnings takes the lion's share. But of course, because it happened over a period of years, personal events, like everyone over a length of time, things happen, and I lost my wife Alex to cancer, lost my dad. So those elements, well, on a very practical level, which is something we haven't talked about but alluded to, is that handcraft spinning, making, just actually using your hands, it was such a solace. It really, really did get me through difficult times. And I think the project just gave me a sense of forward motion, that even though, especially in the aftermath of Alex dying and us having four children together, there wasn't really a lot of time to devote to these things. But the few minutes in a day that I did have to spin were just so healing, and I think psychologically just gave me a sense of forward motion. So anyway, and I think on a partly symbolic level, but it did feel real, was that somehow, especially the spinning, that my sort of internal landscape or emotional state was being spun into the thread, and I really had this sense of, my goodness, how interesting, how if you go back a few hundred years and how we clothed ourselves, it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a village to clothe a village. Um, just how, if your clothes were being spun and made by people you knew, um, that the love being put into the cloth becomes like a talismanic sort of cloth, just imbued with stories and meaning. And I thought, man, that's, even though a shirt on the high street does, of course, have stories attached to it. There would be people you don't know somewhere doing that work. Their internal thoughts and lives are going into that clothing, but you just don't know what they are. It's very fractured, and you can't claw that back. So that directness of it, yeah, it was really interesting. So yeah, Dylan continued to film, and I had no idea what film he was making. I just know that he didn't tell me how I should make the dress. I thought, I'm not going to tell Dylan how he should make the film. But it was, I felt like, because a lot of the stages were done, at least in part, with Dylan there with his camera, and we were old friends from years before. So, it's a very unusual way to make a film over that time without a clear, you know, direction of, even if the dress would work at the end of it all. Um, but he would film a little bit, and then he would edit it, and then he would send it over, and I'd have a look at it. And it was more like he described it as a slow motion conversation. And, we would sort of talk about the bit that we'd just filmed, and certain themes started to just come out of that process. And one of them being this whole fairy tale sort of endeavor to the whole thing. And there was that fairy tale that we allude to in the film itself, of the wild swans, this Hans Christian Andersen, although it's an old tale that's told in many forms. But it specifically talks about nettles, about how 6 or 7 princes get turned into wild swans, and the sister has to undo the enchantment by weaving these shirts or cloaks from nettles, and they have to be collected from graveyards and spun in silence, and then they will undo the enchantment, and the princes are turned back into from swans back into princes, apart from the youngest one, who she doesn't quite get to finish the shirt. So he remains half bird, half human. And just on a Jungian level, it was all so interesting. And how the fact that nettles were alluded to directly, but also that it was a female protagonist. Um, and that sort of, yeah, that just had a resonance, that sort of, that both the association of death and my personal experience of death in relation to the nettles, but how it fed back in. So anyway, so all these elements kind of ended up, and Dill cut, a really wonderful, if very personal story, which sort of took me aback a bit at first. But it 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 was really wonderful, actually, once the film was made and we started taking it out and showing it to people, because even though the subject matter, was quite heavy in parts, um, it just seemed to after the screenings, there was a really joyous atmosphere. And I don't know whether it was because there were a lot of crafters and makers and people, um, gardeners, just the sort of the gentle nature of the film and the way it was put together just seemed to really speak to, and lockdown and what we'd all gone through with that. It just seemed to resonate, it's felt like, it's given a whole extra dimension to the thing. If the film hadn't been made, the Nettle Dress would just be, sitting in a cupboard, but because of the film, it's just taken on this whole life of its own, and we've taken the dress with us, and it's been held and fondled by people, and yeah, it's just been a really wonderful sort of coming together, and also served as a means to have these discussions. And latterly the film's just been out on its own. Dylan and I haven't been touring around with it, but so often it's been shown in association with a community or food growing community or textile groups, and there've been nettle related events and different panels coming on to talk about what their groups in their area are thinking and doing along the lines of brought up by the thing. So yeah, it's been really wonderful, and it's still in cinemas around the place. And to see it or either online or in a cinema, the best place to go is to the Nettle Dress .org, or the Nettle Dress website. There's a Facebook group, there's a Instagram, Nettle Dress Film. Um, and yeah, all the information of how to see it is on there. And yeah, so it's the whole thing's been quite fairy tale like, to be honest. There really wasn't a thought through plan. There just seems to have been a kind of slightly synchronistic, magical nature to the whole endeavor, which has just continued to sort of reverberate out. And yeah, testament to Dylan's sensitivity in telling the story. But it, yeah, I don't really know what more to say than
Well, I
that.
mean, having seen it now all the way through in one go, it is a beautiful film, and Dylan has the videography is gorgeous because there's obviously you walking in the woods and picking the nettles, and there's a bit that we sat in the room and went all at the same time when you were picking them and pulling them out and showing how you could do it without getting stung. And so it's that kind of thing. Watching you with the setting up the looms, and I don't know, it's just something nice and slow about it all. But I don't mean slow in a dull sort of way, but it's just kind of relaxing, which is really nice. And then your personal story and your personal loss, which is obviously woven into the story as well. I think everyone can relate to that in a way, and then how that was put together with the project of making the Nettle Dress, and the slowness of that as well. It's 7 years, wasn't it? I think.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just something. I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, trying to slow down and have a project that isn't about getting everything done as quickly as possible, but doing it really, really well. And I think one of my favorite parts of the whole film is actually the end, where you have your daughter walking through the wood wearing the dress and twirling around, and it's almost like you've gone back in history. It's like this
Yes.
it's this I don't know what it is. It's something that evokes. You can imagine somebody in the Middle Ages walking through the wood in a nettle dress and twirling around and enjoying the sunshine and something. It's just a really beautiful film. I would recommend to anybody to go and watch it. It's just a lovely film.
Oh, thank you, Joe.
And
Yeah.
I hope it carries on, because I think one of the things that's really important about it, the film, is, as you say, it becomes something people can center around to have these conversations. But I think it's also a way of reaching a wider audience, and that's something that we as sort of practitioners of different crafts and thinking around sustainability and decentralization and regeneration, having something that can reach out of our bubble, so to speak, and actually reach a more general public and get people thinking in a slightly different way, or even questioning things that they've never questioned before in their conscious mind. And they watch something and they think that does make sense. I am empowered. I could now go and do something. I could learn to spin or weave or whatever.
Yeah. 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 And we definitely made the deliberate choice not to really include facts about sustainable textiles or we did think about that hard, because it was like, well, there's a chance we've got a vehicle to push forward the message, but in the end, we just felt like the the simplicity and directness of the story just spoke enough about it that when I speak about the film at Q&As, I maybe talk about that side of it a bit more, but yeah, there's something just about the story in itself being enough. And and again, it's going right back to what we talked to. It's so interesting that so many people after the film who've gone through loss and grief, which we all do, just the how we as people deal with grief. And so often it was making handcrafts, being in nature, walking, and just the simple uh, companionship of other human beings were how we get through difficult times. Just it really strips us right back to just these very, very fundamental things, which are the very things which, like we said at the beginning, are those ancient pursuits by which we sustain ourselves: foraging, growing, being in nature, listening to nature. And yeah, and I think the other, I mentioned it in the film that even though the film ostensibly seemed to be about transforming the nettle from a plant through into a finished cloth, really the transformation was the nettle transforming me. And uh, because it was so slow, the process, it forced me to slow down and not think about quick results, and then just a sort of returning to the same place over and over. And so, yeah, I think within me it sort of quelled this desperate search for novelty and newness the whole time, into a sort of seeing what was there in a deeper way. And also that it never felt like drudgery. If I had to make a nettle dress to sell, it would be horrible. It could never find that, you couldn't put a price on it. You'd start to have to add up your labor, and the whole nature of the endeavor would just be something completely different. But where it was, where the hours weren't counted in how much to be earned per hour, but how much solace am I getting from this thing? It's just a totally different calibration. Same with growing food. It's not like how many hours was I up the plot today. It was like, while I was up the plot today, I saw a rainbow, I saw jays playing in the trees, and it it it's it, you, yeah, it's just how we measure these things. So yeah, and that, I think that's really deeply heartening, that knowing at core that we're the things that give us solace and make life worth living are very, very simple things,
Mm.
which
Yeah.
are there.
Yeah, it's a good
You,
point that you make. I think about the sorry, just pick up on what you said there about the if you'd have been making the dress to sell, how different that would have been, because then you'd be measuring everything in a completely different way, wouldn't you? And so
yes,
have it's back to the point we had right at the beginning about true costs again, and measuring, and how we measure things. And the dress in that particular instance, the purpose of it wasn't even really to make a dress for someone to have as a dress, was it? It was a project to see if it could be done, and then it was part of your personal loss. And I thought it was beautiful, the fact that it was your daughter that was the person who ultimately wore the dress, because it was that whole personal connection and love and everything again. So I think, yeah, we lose track. You're right. I mean, I was thinking when you were speaking about when I first started school many moons ago, my mother used to knit my school jumpers, and so we always had the knitted V-neck school jumper, hand knitted. And at a certain point, I got embarrassed about it because the other children had ones that were bought in shops, and then
Yeah.
in the end, my mum stopped knitting them because she worked out it was more expensive to knit them herself than to buy them in in a shop. And you sort of think,
Yeah.
oh, I didn't value it at all. Because now that would have been the norm, that parents would have knitted, grandparents would have knitted and created clothing for their children, and it would have got passed on and passed on, and
Uh,
we lose track of what the importance is of these things.
yeah. I mean, and again, it just shows that how that we all that we have that memory is it's so close by. Things change so dramatically, but it's still within touching distance of how things were done in a different way. And yeah, I mean knitters really astonish me that I'm a very, very poor knitter. I'm still knitting the scarf I started 2 years ago. But how, I'm just astonished by people who put this huge amount of labor in and then give them away to grandchildren and children and friends
Mm.
and I think that that's the other thing that, that the whole process of textiles showed me and the food growing community is I think where I finally felt as an artist that textiles I'd found my medium. It was because of the dynamic of people wanting to pass on knowledge with such generosity, and it was exactly the same in the food growing thing. People come and you'll suddenly find 4 pepper plants on this outside the polytunnel because someone started a few down the path and they don't need them. So there's this sort of giving, and it was the same with textiles. I went to a spinning group in Brighton, and you know people showed me how to do it. Everything I needed to know, someone just showed me how to do it with joy. um, and so that again was like, wow, how interesting that these most fundamental things people want to give away freely. It's goes counter um, to the way most things are set up, where stuff is guarded and hidden.
Yeah,
And
exactly. And
yeah,
your precious resource, and if you give it away, then you're giving away something of value that you shouldn't share. You should hold it close. It's
yeah,
a
exactly. It's a
interesting one,
totally
isn't it?
different dynamic where you gain pleasure by helping other people
Mm,
to achieve results too. And
yeah.
so yeah, I
Wow.
find
Mm,
I find that
mm.
that really
No, it
heartening.
is. It is really, really interesting. And I just, we talked about the nettle dress and some of the other, you alluded to the flax that you grow as well. So it just brings me on to thinking, so what are your current projects? What are you working on now?
So all the while the nettle dress was happening, I was spinning wool, learning to dye, all these different things. So I've woven a few more pieces of cloth in the same vein. I with the nettles that were left over that I didn't end up using in the dress, along with flax and a little bit of flax that I'd grown and spun, hemp that friends had grown but I'd spun. I made and all naturally dyed. So I made a shirt for myself that I've been wearing on when I've been out with a nettle dress. And then I've woven more recently a big piece of cloth out of all the wool that I'd spun, washed again, local fleeces that I get given from down the road that I've taken all the way through. That was or is going to be made into a kilt, although someone very generously spent a day with me, a kilt maker, showing me how to put a kilt together, and I realized actually a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be. So whether that will actually make it into a kilt or not, I'm uncertain. And yeah, I'm just really carrying on, just doing continue with this sort of seasonal cycle of I've just put this year's flax, sown this year's flax, and getting dye plants planted, and when, and I think that's really the other aspect of working with textiles in the way that I enjoy, of taking them through from plant all the way through, or from as far back as I can, is it's a very seasonal thing. So I don't really have to plan. I just wake up each day and I'll go, okay, it's this time of year, this plant's starting to come flower, so I can start to gather that for if it's a dye plant, or if it's something that needs to be sown, and same with the vegetables. So there's like a seasonal rhythm to it all, which seems to just take I just follow that really. That's largely my diary, and I work around it as much as possible. And wherever I can help and show people little bits and pieces of what I've learned, in the hope that it may be helpful to them. And likewise, people do that for me. There's this wonderful flow of information and knowledge, um, and yeah, people doing really interesting and, I think, good things, not just here, all around the world. And
Definitely. I mean, well, we bumped into each other last summer, didn't we, at the contemporary hemp harvest up in
absolutely,
Suffolk, and
yeah,
that was, I know you were spending a lot of time laying out the picked hemp stems and for drying and everything, which you and your doggy was watching very carefully. But it was really interesting. I love the work that's going on. I mean, the amounts of interesting projects happening in the UK at the moment in terms of different fibres. I mean, Claire O'Sullivan, who co-runs Contemporary Hempery, she introduced me to a book called Fibre, which I love, which was talking about how hemp, you actually legally had to grow hemp at one point in the UK. It was illegal to not grow hemp, which is a bizarre thing now, when it's actually you have to jump through so many hoops to actually be allowed to grow hemp at the moment. But hemp makes so
yeah.
much sense, doesn't it?
I know, and the number of community flax growing projects, I just can't keep across them all at the moment, and that's definitely all of the same spirit, of somehow, um, yeah, that these things are being done in community, and as it was at the Contemporary Hempery hemp retreat where we last saw each other, was um, just all coming together to pull the hemp and share knowledge of the hemp. And it's like yeah, I mean, it's just wonderful.
And as you say, it's happening globally. I mean, there's been other people on the podcast in the cotton world, people trying
Yes,
to pull together regenerative cotton growing in India particularly. But I met a lady recently who's trying to revive indigenous cotton in Mexico, because that's where the US varieties originated from. She was very firmly telling us that the US cotton is actually Mexican cotton.
yeah,
So there's this huge history around all of these fibers and wool, as you say. So it's very interesting times. But I feel like the key message from this podcast is about the grassroots side and the democratization side, isn't it? That you can be empowered yourself just by taking control of what is in your control, your own bit of land or even wild land, picking nettles and things like that, and then slowly turning them into things that you need without having to always be having external inputs for everything.
yeah, no, absolutely. I think I totally agree.
Anyway,
From
I think we've been talking for over an hour, so
right.
I think we could probably talk for even longer, but never mind. That's good. So, is there any other message you'd like to pass on to the people listening to this podcast, Alan?
Um, no, I think beyond what we've discussed, just get your hands in the soil, get your hands onto your materials, and yeah, just enjoy it.
That sounds amazing advice. And I will add, when I put out the podcast, I will add links to the Nettle Dress and to Alan's Instagram, which always has interesting things going on there as well. And only to say thank you so much, Alan, for coming on the Where Does It Come From podcast. It was a pleasure, as I knew it would be, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again.
Yep. Thank you very much for having me. And yes, I'll be seeing you at some Cardi event or fiber
Yeah,
event
some
before
event,
long.
some fiber fabric type event in the hopefully near future. So thank you,
Absolutely.
Alan.
Thank you, Jay.